Hi, and welcome back to the Perkins Podcast. This is Alan Perkins of Horns Digest. Today I'm going to be going over the Texas-Baylor game and analyzing some of the things that happened in that game. I'm going to start off with a couple stats that maybe just wouldn't have been right in the box score, but after digging a little bit, just some other stats that I found interesting. So Texas won the game 35-34 on a late field goal by Trent Domain. And it was a back and forth, crazy, wild game. But anyways, a couple of things that I noticed that stuck out. Texas scored on the first two drives and the last two drives of the game, and that accounted for 24 of their 35 points. And every Texas scoring drive except every single Texas scoring drive except for a one-play drive where they scored right after an interception. Every other drive besides that spanned 60 yards or more, and all of Texas's drive lasted only 2 minutes and 47 seconds or less. And there was one drive that was 58 yards, but almost 60 yards. So I thought that was interesting that all their other drives were very long besides the one after the interception. That was the first time that Texas has scored after a turnover in a long time. They've had a lot of trouble getting points off of turnovers this year. Baylor started the game with a touchdown, an interception, and then a touchdown. And then later in the game, they scored in chunks again. So starting from the last drive of the second quarter until early in the fourth quarter, Baylor racked up touchdown, field goal, fumble inside the UT 10, and a field goal. So they obviously made successful halftime adjustments with all those scores there. Although at the end of the game they finished field goal, fumble, field goal. So they kind of ran out of gas there at the end. Baylor ran 69 plays, 68 rushes and 28 passes, and Texas only ran 72 plays with 51 rushes and 21 passes. The UT defense had 11 tackles for loss, 6 sacks, 1 interception, 1 fumble recovery, and 3 forced fumbles. And all that added up to 2 turnovers. Some of the defensive standouts were Malik Jefferson, who had 10 tackles and 2.5 for loss and 2 sacks. Anthony Wheeler had 9 tackles and 2 forced fumbles. Brecken Hager had 6 tackles and 2.5 tackles for loss. And P.J. Locke got both UT turnovers. Texas had trouble scoring after turnovers this year. Like I said, they got 7 points off of 2 turnovers yesterday. And they scored after the P.J. Locke got the interception when Chris Boyd deflected the ball up in the air. Texas then sacked Russell on a 4th and 12 for a turnover on down, so I kind of count that as a turnover. And then for the Texas turnovers, Armonte Foreman made a huge catch and run, but fumbled around the Baylor 10, and Baylor recovered. I believe that was in the second quarter. And Texas did not score after recovering a fumble inside their own 10. Baylor had an average third down distance to gain of 6.4, and UT had an average third down distance to gain of 6.2. And both teams did poorly on third and long, which should be expected, but both teams were near 50% converting third and short. When Baylor elected to run on third down, they averaged 7.2. And that was Texas' best game regarding penalties this year. Terrence Williams, Baylor's backup running back, had 24 carries for 180 yards, averaging 7.5 yards per carry, and Shock Linwood only averaged 3.9 yards per carry on 17 attempts. And he was held out later in the game, and even the third-string back got more time than Shock Linwood towards the end of the game, which the commentators and fans were still trying to figure out why that was, because Linwood didn't appear to be injured. So we're still trying to get to the bottom of that. Couple stats that I noticed that kind of stuck out from each quarter, where there was a discrepancy or a difference between the teams as far as separation. In the first quarter, Texas was 3 for 6 on third downs for 50%, and Baylor was only 1 for 3 for 33%. In the second quarter, Texas had 10 carries for only 1.9 yards. In the third quarter, Baylor had 178 yards and Texas only had 72, and that's when Baylor made their big run. And neither team had penalty yards in the third quarter. And then in the third quarter, Baylor was 5 for 6 and Texas was 0 for 3. So, again, we were talking about those chunks of points and drives that Baylor got and Texas didn't. That's why. And then in the fourth quarter, Baylor on third down was 1 of 4 for 25%, and Texas was 2 for 4 for 50%. And that's when Baylor started failing in the red zone in inside UT's 10, come away with only field goals and turnovers. And in the fourth quarter, Texas averaged 10.9 yards per play, and Baylor only averaged 5.8 yards per play. So that was a bit of a change from what had happened earlier in the game. And Baylor also had a turnover and a turnover on downs in the fourth quarter, and Texas had 0 turnovers in the fourth quarter. So that was the difference in a very close game. Some people were surprised that Baylor had a 31-19 advantage in first downs. I think some of that came down to the fact that when Texas would get explosive plays, that they were really explosive, like 30 or 40 yards. So that's essentially getting 3 or 4 first downs in one play, so it doesn't show up in the box score like that, obviously. Lots of times Baylor would get 10 and 15-yard gains, especially on their huge runs, 10 to 15 yards. So the difference in total yards was fairly minimal, so that's my assumption for why the difference was 12 more first downs for Baylor, because it was less than 100 yards difference in total yards. Dixon was great. He averaged 52.7 yards per punt. Michael Dixon, the punter for Texas, on 6 punts. And Domain was 2 for 2 from field goals on 25 and 39 yards. So Deontay Foreman had a huge game. He had 250 yards on 32 carries, averaging 7.8 yards per carry. And he broke the 1,000-yard barrier for rushing, and he became the first running back from UT to do it since 2007, which is pretty scary and sad for UT fans that it's taken that long. As always, Foreman broke tackles, used good vision and patience, and he always fell forward, and he even played through pain as he got injured in the fourth quarter. But he played through pain and came back onto the field. He actually had 215 yards just after 3 quarters. So, he was great, as always. And he also threw in a Heisman pose after one of his touchdowns just for good measure. The biggest takeaway for me in this game was that Texas punched back when things weren't going well. And they fought and they clawed and they just believed that things would turn around even when they weren't going well. And Texas didn't beat themselves as much today. They didn't have as many penalties. Like I said, only 4 for 23 yards, and Buechele had an interception, but it was on a 4th down from the Baylor 20, so it was basically like a punt anyways, and you had to throw it to somebody and force it in there if nobody was open because it was 4th down, so might as well take a shot. Texas also did well to take the lead against Baylor, and then when they got behind, they kept it close, and the deficit was always manageable, so hopefully that means that the team is growing up mentally and emotionally. I thought the offensive line had one of their better days. Buechele did not get hit or pressured as much as he has in recent weeks, and the O-line opened up some huge holes for Foreman, and Deontay took advantage of that. The Foreman brothers, Armonte and Deontay, combined for 392 yards, and this is the best game of the season for both of them, in my opinion, considering the stakes, Charlie Strong being on the hot seat, and the fact they were playing a top 10 team. Considering what Texas had done against Cal and Oklahoma State and OU, I was happy to see a little bit of defensive improvement. Baylor still ran for 398 yards, which is obviously pathetic, but and they gave up 34 points and over 600 yards of offense. But there was some good things that I saw. I saw players that were more aggressive. I saw players that played with more confidence, and the defense made some big plays, even though they gave up a lot of yards. And the Texas DBs were more physical, and they located the ball in flight a lot of times and were able to knock the ball down, which they've had a big problem with this year. And I was even glad to see Texas hold Baylor and put their hands on the receivers and make the officials call penalties on them if that's what they're going to do, but just to figure out how the refs were going to officiate that game, because it's really important as the defensive back to be physical with the receiver and mess up the timing of an offense and frustrate the receiver so they can't get into a rhythm, even if that means you're getting a penalty, especially with the college rules of only getting 15 yards for a pass interference instead of the spot of the foul like it is in the NFL. I think it's totally worth it to get some penalties, and because they might not call it every time, and if they don't call it even that one time, that might be the time that you can get an interception like Texas got when Chris Boyd held the receiver, but with one hand and got his hand around the receiver on the other, popped it up, and then P.J. Locke had the interception. So it's on the officials in my mind, so I think that's exactly the way to go about it. And then you can figure out, okay, this is what they're going to call, this is what they're not going to call, and then move on from there. Armani Foreman did some great things against Baylor. He had 142 yards receiving on 4 catches and a touchdown. He was only targeted 4 times, so all 4 targets, he caught all 4 balls. Foreman did well to use his hands, and he created space from the defensive back, and his body control and his awareness were fantastic, and he gathered the ball in tight windows along the sideline. They were not easy catches. So that was a great bounce-back game for him after dropping the ball in the end zone on 4th down against Kansas State last week. That was huge. Buechele's QBR and stat line would have looked better without the interception, and the interception, in my opinion, was John Burt's fault because he didn't come back to the ball on a hitch route. Baylor's Ryan Reed was the one that got the interception, and Ryan Reed just outworked him to get back to the ball first. Burt just stopped and waited. He didn't come back upfield towards the ball. So, Buechele also hit 7 different receivers against Baylor, and no wide receiver had more than 7 catches. Granted, Buechele only threw it 21 times as Texas tried to hammer the ball in the ground game, so that's not that surprising. I'd imagine that Sterling Gilbert would want to get Devin Duvernay and Dorian Leonard the ball more in space, or like on wide receiver screens, but the receivers are going to have to prove that they can block better. And I was glad that UT did not throw many screens against Baylor, and I bet it was the least amount of screens they've thrown this year because the receivers have not been blocking it very well. So, I just think that until they block it better, that Texas shouldn't really waste their time with screens because it hasn't been working very well, and Buechele's had trouble throwing that pass accurately. That's been his least effective pass, probably because he's trying to get out in such a hurry. Holden Hill is still lacking in confidence and not making plays. Hopefully he'll turn it around. He has all the talent in the world, but he needs to kind of find himself mentally because he's been struggling this year. So those are my thoughts on the game, and I just thought that it was an important game, and it's a potential turnaround game, but Texas fans also thought that the Notre Dame game would be a turnaround spot, so we'll just have to see when Texas goes on the road against Texas Tech this week if they can carry that momentum over. So I'm Alan Perkins from Horns Digest. I appreciate you listening to the Perkins Podcast, and make sure to check out Horns Digest, where you can find Chip Brown and all of his expertise with his 25 years of covering Texas athletics, and you can get all the inside information from him and yours truly. Thanks a lot. Have a great day, and I will see you all on the flip side.